Tonight we're going to look a little bit at some lessons we can get from Job. Some we're going to learn from things he did well, and others will learn from things he maybe didn't do quite as well. And a lesson tonight is one that we will all deal with. And I think probably no matter how old we get, we will still have to deal with this subject, and that is criticism. And I think sometimes as we get older, one of the things that we might be tempted to do is spend some time in our heads reliving old criticisms that hit us and hurt us, but we can still remember them. Just as an exercise in this, I set a timer for 3 minutes and thought, I'm going to write down every criticism that I can remember off the top of my head in 3 minutes. And so a few of them I'll share with you. These are some of the criticisms that I've had over the last few years, and it's just part of living. So here's some of the things that people have said to me, particularly, as my job is to travel and speak. So one is that you flip your hair too much. And that's a possibility. And so after I had been told that, I started wearing my hair up a lot more. And then, believe it or not, someone else came to me and said, I really don't like when you wear your hair in a bun. It makes you look older than you are. Okay, so that's it. I have been told I don't like your singing. Okay, well, I can appreciate that. And this one was an interesting one. I will not be able to come hear you speak again because you preach from a satanic Bible. That was a reference to, I don't use the King James Version, I use the New American Standard. And this one is a valid criticism. You walk around way too much when you speak. I admit that I do that. I move a lot. And then I had a parishioner say this to me one time. I wish we had a pastor who didn't get their sermons off the internet. I'm not sure where they got the idea that I got my sermons off the internet, but they also didn't believe in the internet at all. So, and these were interesting, and I have heard these as a pastor, and so have you if you have pastored. You are gone from the church too much. You are at the church way too much and should be home with your family. And this was an interesting one. If you really cared about you and your husband's ministry, you would wear more makeup. And I had one person who was a guest in the church, and at the end of the service, I was back, and I happened to have been in the worship team that morning, and he greeted me and said, I just really feel like you need to take piano lessons. Okay, well, you don't preach enough about prophecy. I had one man say to me, and it was a young man, so that was interesting. He said, you don't seem to like old people. Your sermons are way too long, and that's probably a valid criticism. You should eat more. We never see you eat at church gatherings. That's probably true because I'm running around. And I had someone say to me one time, you really should lose weight before you wear that dress again. Now, in 3 minutes, I can remember all that, plus several more on here that I'm not sharing with you, because most of those were pretty easy to take. But there are some that are very personal, and that hit hard, and that we grapple with, and we struggle with. And if any of you were to set a buzzer for 3 minutes, you could write the same kinds of lists, couldn't you? And this is simply something that is part of our existence. If you're going to be in the game on the field, you're going to run the risk, and it's not just a probability, it is a likelihood you will get hit while you're on the field playing the game. When I was a senior in high school, one of my teachers, Earlene Craig, left a note on my desk when I came in the morning. I found this note on my desk, and here's what it said. It said, to avoid criticism, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing. And at the bottom she wrote this: prepare yourself for a life of criticism. E.C. Erling Craig. And what my teacher was saying to me is that if I wanted to be someone, which I did my senior year in high school, I wanted to do something with my life. I wanted to say some things to the world that I was going into as a 17-year-old. I wanted to be something. And she wanted me to prepare myself, because if I was going to do and say and be anything, I was going to have a life with criticism. And that has been the absolute truth. Would you say the same? Sure. Now, in the lessons that we have had, tonight we're going to be looking a lot at Job 18 and 19, and we've looked at those chapters before in some of the doubting. We'll kind of be a little bit all over the map. But we've met a few people in this play that we've been looking at, this story in the Bible. We've met Job, we've met Job's wife, and we've met Job's 3 friends. And we saw that the friends were good friends with very good intentions, right? We talked about that a few weeks ago. When Job's friends heard that he was in trouble, they came, each one of them from their own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together, and what was their purpose in coming? We see 2 things there. What are they? To sympathize and to comfort. And we talked about those 2 words a few weeks ago. To sympathize is to feel the pain of the person. And to comfort is to lift the burden that they're carrying, to bring comfort to an uncomfortable time. To lift that burden and bring comfort in a time of discomfort. Those were good goals. But then they opened their mouths. And we saw a few weeks ago, we looked at how good theology misapplied becomes bad theology. You remember those lessons? Well, let's take a look at the 3 different ways that these friends addressed Job's issues. Eliphaz, one of the ways that he addresses Job's issues is to criticize Job's integrity. You know, Job, if you were really a good man, this wouldn't have happened to you. Because we know that God punishes the bad and blesses the good. You are not being blessed, you are being punished, therefore you must be bad. So his integrity was brought into question. Job, you are not a good man. You are full of fault. Bildad, much of his criticism focused on Job's very value. You know, Job, you're saying that you've done all these good things, but you can't really be that great a man. You know, God must not love you as much as he loves everybody else. There's something inherently wrong with you, Job, or this wouldn't be happening to you. Questioning his value to God. And then Zophar criticizes his faith. You know, Job, you say you are righteous, but we know that you have sins. And at one point, Zophar lists off a bunch of sins, as if to say, we'll list the sins, and when we get to yours, Job, you just raise your hand, because you are not as righteous before God as you've been saying you are. And even to this day, criticism seems to focus on these 3 things. What we do. You ever been criticized for something you've done? Who you are. Have you ever been criticized for that? Something you just who you are, it can't be helped, but you are criticized for it, and what we believe. If you've never been criticized for your belief system, get on a social media site, go on and say, I believe this, and within a few minutes, somebody will come on and criticize you for that belief. That's reality. So these are the three things, and these all are difficult, are they not? Because when we do something, we want it to be good. Who we are at the core of our being, we want to be accepted. And what we believe for a reason, and we think other people should believe what we believe. And if somebody questions our faith, then that can be a very difficult thing. So let's go and look at Job's example. That's where our lesson's going to be. From his example, what can we learn from the example of Job about handling criticism? Because we all do we not? Okay, the first thing that we see Job do when he is criticized, and this is so valuable, is that he listened patiently. Do you remember there at the end of the chapter 2 when the friends come and it says they sat in silence for 7 days? And then the first one to speak in chapter 3 was Job himself. He broke the silence. And really, and we understand why, he starts off with a pitiful statement. We are of an age in here, if you were allowed to watch TV in the 1970s, you heard a song that said, "Gloom, despair, and agony on me, deep, dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me." And that's where we groan, right? That was from Hee Haw. Maybe you weren't allowed to watch Hee Haw, but it was one of the few things I was allowed to watch was Hee Haw. And he gives this lament through chapter 3, which is understandable. But then beginning in chapter 4, and this is where we see it, because Job listens to all of this criticism through chapter 4, 5, 8, 11, 15, 18, 20, 22, 25, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 37. He listens to all of this criticism for all of this time. And so one of the things I want us to see about Job is when you have spent a lot of time having someone tell you what is wrong with you, one of the ways to respond is to listen patiently. How do we do this? Well, here's some counsel. What's one of the keys to listening patiently? Not responding immediately. Because our temptation in this is to immediately defend ourselves, right? To make excuses for why we did that, to explain, well, there's a reason that I'm like this, or these kinds of things. And what often happens is when we respond immediately, we miss what is really being said. And so I find in myself one of my biggest problems in times like this is when someone else is talking to me in this way, rather than listening to them, I am formulating my answer in my head. I hope nobody else is guilty of that, but rather than listening, I'm often just sitting there waiting for them to stop talking because I have already prepared a rebuttal. But learning to not respond immediately, because quite often when we respond to something immediately out of the emotion of the moment, then we often miss what needs to happen from this situation. So there's a good thing. And then don't just jump in immediately with excuses. It's best to evaluate what's being said before we just jump in and spout off. Because if we don't listen to criticism, because here's something I have learned, and I'm probably the youngest person in this room, so I may not be the best one to tell you what I have learned in my long life, because you're way ahead of me in these lessons. But one of the things I have learned is regardless of the situation that I am in, there is something to learn. Either there's something I need to learn about me, or something that I can learn about the person doing the criticism. For example, when we were in our first church, and it was about the second Sunday that we were there, and I am 21 years old, so I am very wet behind the ears, And I'm just excited. We were just excited that anybody would actually give us this opportunity. We felt like we should pay them for letting us be their pastors. And I'd come in, and there was an older lady, Sister Elsie. And she was sitting in her place, and I came over, and she began to speak to her very young pastor's wife by listing all of the faults of the previous pastor's wives. She told me everything that she didn't like about the last 6 pastors' wives. And I was standing there thinking, why on earth is she telling me this? And then it occurred to me this right here. The Lord is letting me hear this so that I will know when she talks about me that way, it's not about me. That's who she is. So it wasn't about me learning something about myself at that point, but learning something about her, because she would probably put me in that same list, and she did. She was the one, matter of fact, who told me I needed to lose weight before I wore that dress again. If you're in heaven listening, Sister Elsie, we loved you. We did. You all have pastored Elsies, haven't you? Sure. And so one of the things that we want to learn to do is to, rather than open our mouth immediately, listen and learn. Okay, another thing that we learn from Job is to reply respectfully. After we have listened and go to give a reply to this criticism that we're hearing, it needs to be done with respect. Now, this is one of those lessons that we can learn from Job, where he didn't always do it maybe as well as he could have. Because one of the things at the end of chapter 11, when one of his friends finally stops speaking, and it is Job's opportunity now to reply to this criticism of how awful he must really be to be going through this punishment, his words are these. With total sarcasm dripping from himself, Job responded, "Well, truly then you are the people. With you wisdom will die." What he's saying here is that you are these people that just think you know it all. You know everything. And boy, as soon as you're out of the picture, wisdom is just going to die because you know it all. Can you hear the sarcasm dripping from this statement? Rarely is sarcasm the best response, but sometimes it creeps out of our mouth, does it not? I had this happen to me. One of the ladies in the church came and asked me if I would attend an event that her group was putting on. And it was on a night that I knew I couldn't attend, and rather than just saying, "I'm sorry, I won't be able to attend," I thought I should make excuses. And so I began to tell her what my week looked like, that I had to do this and this and this on this night, and I had this other night and this. And then she looked at me and said, "You know what? You need to learn how to say no." And I responded by saying, "Well, I just did. It just happened to be to you." That was not the wisest response that I could have given to that lady in that moment, because it didn't respect her. So here's some tips on this replying respectfully. Number 1, respond to the suggestion, the criticism. Respond to that rather than to the tone. Because the thing is, often what sets us off is the way it's said. Not what's being said, but the way it's said. And, sometimes have you ever had anybody say to you, "Well, I'm just saying the brutal truth." And what you want to say is, "Well, I can understand the truth, but I think you added the brutal part. And the brutal was not necessary to get the truth across." But sometimes people do that. They add the brutal to it, and our response then is to the brutality rather than the actual subject of the matter. And this is where we have to learn this. When someone comes in and goes off on you, you have to respond to what they say and not their tone. At some point, somebody has to be the grown-up. The best ministry training that I got, as good as my training at CBC was, it was not the best training that I got. It helped me with learning to study and all of those things. But on practicalities from preparing for ministry, I got much of my training as a waitress. Learning how to be a servant to people. Learning how to look around and find things that need to be done and how to deal with people. And as a waitress, how many of you have ever waited tables? Okay, a few of us have. One of the things you have to learn when you are a server in a situation like that is how to respond to what the customer is truly saying and not the way they say it to you. Because sometimes you get somebody, and this was particularly true on Sunday afternoons at the restaurant. I don't know what people heard in church that made them so mad, but by the time they got to the restaurant, they were rather unkind. And I remember one table, it was table 46 back in the back. See, I still remember it. Young freshman, trying to work my way through college and overwhelmed. And this man in a suit who had obviously been to church pulled me, grabbed my arm and said, "Hadn't anybody got any sense back there to bring me some silverware?" Now, what was it that he wanted? Silverware. And so the proper response to that was simply to bring him some silverware. The temptation is to put him last on your list to serve and let him wait while you took care of the rest of the tables and let him wait for his silverware. But is that respectful of the need? And so we learn to respond to the suggestion, the content, not the way it is said. Somebody told me a long time ago, and this was wise, you can be a thermostat or you can be a thermometer. How many of you have heard that illustration? Sure. A thermostat sets the temperature. You go up to the wall and you want it to be 75 degrees in the house, so you set it to 75. And the temperature around then adjusts to that 75. A thermometer measures what the temperature already is. You can't adjust a thermometer. It tells you what it is. It responds to the situation rather than setting the situation. And here's what we need to learn how to do, to be thermostats, to set the temperature, and regardless of what the circumstance around, we're going to run a cool 75. If we're running as a thermometer, then if somebody comes to us at 90 degrees, we're going to match their 90 degrees. You see what I'm saying in the difference there? And so what we want to do is be the grown-up, the mature person who can say, you know what? The temperature in this conversation needs to be 75. So I'm not going to raise my level to your 90. All right, so responding respectfully, which we didn't see Job do quite as much there in chapter 12. And don't take it personal. Too many times somebody says something to us and we think that it's all about us. And that was why the Lord let me see from Sister Elsie that second Sunday there that it wasn't about me. And how much pain and concern and frustration as a young 21-year-old I was able to save myself when I heard that she just criticized pastors' wives. It's just what she did. And so when she came to me about a year later and she said, you know, when I was raising my children, we kept them in the church. We didn't take them back to the nursery. You need to keep those children in the pew. I just knew that's Sister Elsie. And I oh, well, that's interesting, Elsie. Thank you. And then I took my child to the nursery. There wasn't anybody to work in the nursery, so I had to stay in the nursery. But I didn't have to respond to that because it really wasn't about me. And then this is a hard one. Don't be overly sensitive. Have you ever run into somebody that you just didn't want to tell them anything? Because no matter what you said, they just took it to a level that you didn't mean it to be. And we tend to want to distance ourselves from those people. So let's not be those people. Let's not be so thin-skinned that everything that is said just can get down into the deepest part of us. Sometimes we need to have a little bit of some thick skin there. And the other thing I have learned with this sensitivity, and I don't understand this, and so maybe if some of you have observed this as well and have figured out why it is, let me know. But one of the things that I have observed is those that are so quick to criticize other people are least able to take criticism themselves. I haven't figured out why that is, but I have observed that. And if anybody knows, let me know. So that's one thing that we want to be aware of and watch for ourselves, is being overly sensitive. And I have learned, an older woman told me this about dealing with criticism. She said, after they've given you everything and their thoughts, you simply say, well, thank you for your thoughts. And that is a great ender to the conversation. And with your face, you say, thank you for your thoughts. You don't have to say, I agree with you, I don't agree with you. Just thank them for your thoughts, and we need to just simply respond. It ends the conversation with neutrality. So some of you may go home to your spouse tomorrow and just simply say, thank you for your thoughts. Okay, so we learn, first of all, we listen patiently. And then when we do respond, after we've listened, we respond respectfully. And here's the thing about respect. It's not dependent on the other person. We behave respectfully because we are respectful people. I drilled this into my children. You are to respond in a respectful way because that is who you are, regardless of the other people around you. Okay, so we reply, when we do finally speak, we reply respectfully, and then, as we reply, it is okay to share your own thoughts about what has been shared. Job does this in chapter 19, 2-4. He responds to the criticism that they are giving to him. Because here's a fact, their opinions matter, but so do yours. And so it is okay to share your own thoughts on what you're saying. Job responded, and listen to this response. How long will you torment me and crush me with words? These 10 times you have insulted me. You are not ashamed to wrong me. Even if I have truly erred, my error lodges with me. And I want you to look at the words that he uses here. He's very honest in sharing his thoughts about what's being shared. He uses the words torment, crush, insult, and wronged, because that's how he felt he was being treated. You know, it's okay to admit that it hurts, because it does. It does. I have yet to decide where I land on that statement, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I understand the thought behind it, because words are not going to put you in the hospital. Words are not going to break your bones. Words are not going to leave bruises. Sticks and stones do that. So words will never hurt me. But on the converse, the words may not send you to the hospital, but that doesn't mean that they don't destroy a part of who you are and the way you think about yourself. These words that Job uses. Your words, nobody hit him. He said, you've tormented me and crushed me with words. You've insulted, you have wronged me. And the fact that any of us could sit down and write down criticisms that we have heard and still remember shows us that they affected us. And it is okay to let people know that hurts. All right. Now, it's okay to admit that it hurts. And it's okay to shed more light on the situation. There's an old story, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it from several different speakers, so I'm just going to repeat it and for the sake of illustration. that there was a mother on a bus with 3 or 4 little kids, and the kids were just behaving horribly. I mean, they were just out of control, screaming and crying and jumping up and not staying in their seat. And the mom was just sitting there, just staring blankly ahead like she didn't even hear them, like she didn't even realize they were her kids. And the whole bus was pretty upset at the behavior of the children. They were loud, they were obnoxious, they were concerned, and the mother wasn't doing anything to correct them. And finally, somebody on the bus came up to her and said, "Ma'am, don't you see that your children are out of control and you haven't done one thing to discipline them?" And she looked up at them with that blank stare in her face and said, "I'm so sorry. We've just come from the hospital and we've learned that their daddy has died. And please forgive my children." Sometimes we need to shed some more light on the situation, and that's okay to do. Just do it respectfully and truthfully, setting that 75-degree temperature rather than elevating to their 90. Okay, so we have learned that at criticism, we listen patiently, and then when we do reply, we reply respectfully, that it is okay in our reply to share our own thoughts and opinions, and then we have to consider the source. Because here's where criticism often really gets into us. In the moment of the criticism, we listen, we try to be respectful, we might share, more information, but where the criticism gets really bad is after the person has left. And then we rehearse and evaluate and what's it called, what a cow does? He chews the cud. And we just keep bringing that back up and chewing on it, which doesn't sound appetizing, but how many of you have ever chewed the cud? Something that you swallowed and needed to stay down, but you kept bringing it up. So here's some counsel on dealing with it afterward. Because in the moment, we tend to respond, usually, fairly decently, but then we go home. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, we're laying there thinking of all the things we should have said. And so here's some things to help us with that. Consider the source. And this is a good thing. Job 26:4. I just love this response to some of the criticism. And he asks the question, whose spirit was speaking through you? Whose spirit was that? This is a good question. We need to consider the source of where that came from, because there are different spirits that try to speak things into our lives, right? There is the Spirit of God. And so when someone has come to us with something, we need to consider, is the Lord trying to tell me something? That's what I did with Sister Elsie. I felt the Lord was showing me something to prepare. The Lord was telling me that. God could be using this criticism to reveal to us something He wants us to be aware of and adjust. It could be the spirit of that person. Have you ever been having a bad day and you just jumped on somebody without reason, without fairness? You were just having a bad day and you went in there and just behaved badly. Whose spirit was speaking through you? Yours. And we have to remember there is an enemy of our soul, and sometimes that spirit is speaking through this criticism, wanting to destroy something within us. And so we have to consider the source. And so here's some practical ways we can do that. Number one, is this person qualified to make this judgment? Now, for instance, that guest that told me after the service that I needed to take some piano lessons. If that had been Brother Aiken, I would take that a little differently than if it was somebody who can't even clap on time. right? Because he probably knows what he's talking about, and he may be saying, there's some things that you could learn. I might even be able to help you with that. That's a good source. When they say something like that, then you take that. And on the converse, considering the source, even not just criticism, but with positive things. If I play something on the piano and Donna says, that was really good, then that just means something more to me than somebody that doesn't know anything about the piano, right? So is the person qualified to make this judgment? If they're not qualified, then you might just let some of that go. But if they are qualified to evaluate that and to give you some feedback on that, then it's a whole different ballgame. If the boss sits you down and tells you need to stop talking so much during work, you need to listen to that, probably a little more than when your coworker just says, stop talking. Okay? Is the person qualified to make this judgment? Do they fully know what they are talking about? And this is something that is difficult to ascertain. If we look at Jesus on the cross there in Luke 23, I think he gives us some good counsel here. They are hurling insults at him. Do you remember that? That specifically said, and they hurled insults at him. And as they're hurling those insults, the response of Jesus is this: Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Here's something I think is a reality. Most of the time when people hurl insults and hurtful words at us, they really don't know what they're doing. Some of us had parents or siblings that said things to us that so damaged us inside, and we carried that for years. And at some point, we may need to see this kind of response. I really don't think my mom knew what she was doing. She didn't know how deeply that hurt me. To her, it may have been completely off the cuff. I did this with one of my daughters one time, several years ago, when she was a young teen. She had done something, and I said, "Oh, you're just like your Aunt Nancy." And she knew that Nancy was a little flighty and all of that. Oh, I shouldn't say this, I'm being recorded. But it was about 12 years later when we were having a deep conversation, and she went back to that and how hurtful that had been to her. Did I know what I was doing? Absolutely not. And sometimes, as we consider the source, we have to stop and think, do they really know what they're doing? Because here's the reality we've all heard. Hurt people hurt people. And when the pain is inside of them, it will come out. Pain always comes out. And a lot of times, it comes out in an unhealthy way. And so what happens is when that pain inside comes out, that pain gets on other people and it inflicts them. And so what we have to remember is that we will sometimes snap at people when we aren't even mad at them. And so sometimes we have to give the benefit of the doubt and not allow their pain to become our pain. Because then we will go and inflict that pain on somebody else. There's the old story of the boss comes into work and yells at the secretary. And so she's having a bad day. So when the male person comes in, she yells at them. And so the male person now, he's having a bad day. And he goes out for lunch and yells at the waitress in the restaurant. And so then she goes back and yells at the cook. And so the cook goes back and yells at the lady doing the dishes. And finally the lady doing the dishes goes home and yells at her husband. And her husband then is upset, so he yells at the kid. And the kid is upset, so he just kicks the dog. And all that line, how much better it would have been if the boss just went to the house and kicked the dog and left all those other people out. That's not permission to kick dogs, all right? But we evaluate and consider the source. Are they hurting in some way. And if it is, then you can take that they're hurting. It doesn't mean you don't need to listen and learn, but it also helps you to know how to evaluate when you're doing all that ruminating. Okay, now, we have listened, we've replied respectfully, we have shared some more truth into the situation, and we have considered the source. Now, this one is a little hard. We need to look for the truth in what is being said, because sometimes there's a grain of truth, even though it may have been said in a way that was brutal. There may be a grain of truth. Listen to what Job says in chapter 6. Teach me, and I will be silent. Show me how I have erred. How painful are honest words. Have you ever experienced the pain of honest words? This part can be hard, looking for what might be the truth in what they're saying, because sometimes the criticism is based in fact. And so as we're doing all this ruminating, after we have had this confrontation, after these words have been said to us, one of the things we need to evaluate is whether it's constructive criticism or destructive criticism. And there's a difference between the two. We've had both, haven't we? And so let's take a look at that. So here's the question to help us determine between the two. And at its heart, is this person genuinely trying to help me? I had a man in our church, his name was Andy. And Andy was one of the most encouraging people you could ever pastor. I'm not a big fan of cloning, but if I could clone someone, it would have been Brother Andy. He was that kind of a man in the church. But he was not always non-critical. If he saw something that he felt could be improved, he did not shy away from saying it. But because of the relationship that we had, because of who I knew him to be, I knew that when he came into my office and said something to me, he was genuinely trying to help me. Thank God for these people. We absolutely need them in our life. And so here's how we can tell those things. The tone. The tone will tell us if they're really trying to help us or if they're just spouting off. You know what we've learned, lived long enough to be able to discern from that. The relationship is a big factor on this. And that relationship, the relationship I had with Andy, he could come in and say pretty much anything to me. And that would make the difference. And having this kind of relationship with the tone makes a big difference. We had a lady in our first church, Sister Clarice. Sister Clarice did not approve of any of my husband's ties. I don't know why. She just did not. And every Sunday, he could pretty much know that as he was greeting people at the door, Clarice would have something to say about his tie. And finally, I went to her and said, Clarice, why don't you buy him a tie that you like? And she did. And he would wear that tie quite often, and she always complimented it. And so in her mind, she was genuinely trying to help him. And then I have learned on this. There is something to the initial gut response. When we are people filled with the Spirit, we can trust the Holy Spirit to speak to us through all of these things. And here's something that I have learned as I have faced criticism in my own life. Is my initial gut response confusion? How did they come up with that? What am I doing that is communicating that? I'm really confused. Or is my initial gut response conviction of, oh, there's some real truth in that statement? And for me personally, so much of the criticism that I have had in the things that I do have to do with something I cannot change. And that is the fact that I am a woman. And I have a lot of criticism because of that. Matter of fact, just yesterday, a very prominent conservative commentator that works for a very large organization, 300 million followers on his things. And he posted a video of a female pastor and saying something that quite honestly was heretical. What she was saying was heretical. That's not up for debate. But his statement to his 300 million followers was that what this female pastor is saying is heretical, but really just the fact that she is a female pastor is already heretical. Now, was he directing that at me? No. Did it hit me? Yes. And so in those, I had one person say to me one time, you want to take a man's job. Have you ever considered whether or not you might actually be a lesbian? And no, I actually hadn't considered that. But my initial gut response was confusion. How have I communicated to this person that I might be a closet lesbian? What have I done? But there are other times my initial gut response is, yeah. There's some truth to that statement. And so these are some of the ways that we can discern if it's constructive or destructive criticism. Now, once we've discerned that, how do we deal with it? If it's destructive considerism, again, consider the source. Is this one person saying this or 10 people saying this? If it's one person, because people will come to you and they say, well, they're all saying, and the reality is that they're all saying is me and my brother. Those are the ones that are all that are saying it. So if one person comes up and says to you, you need piano lessons, then okay. But if 10 people have come up to you and said, you really need piano lessons before you get up and try to play for worship, we consider that. Even though it might not feel like the person is trying to help you, there may be some truth in this, and we need to consider that. And this is a valuable thing that we have. For instance, I got a call from somebody just today with a complaint about some things that had happened in something. And my question to them was, how many people responded this way? And she said, well, there were 2. And my next question was, okay, are they people that usually complain? Or is it somebody that really never complains? Because that's going to make a difference in my response to how I need to deal with this criticism. So considering that source. Because I am one who takes criticism probably too seriously. I am also a self-critic, and I've had to learn how to deal with both of those. Now, on the other side of this, we need to know that there may be those who will say one thing bad, and for instance, if I am speaking somewhere at a church, and one person comes up to me and says, you went really long today. But 10 other people come up and say, oh, I could have heard you speak for another hour. Do you know which one I remember when I leave? The first one. I could have had 10 people who said, you could have gone on, but that one person. And so we need to consider that source. Is this one person who felt like it was way too long? And then 10 other people said it was good. And this is where we have to learn to get through that self-critic. Is it something, if they're criticizing, and it doesn't seem like they're really trying to help, but is it something that you really could change without any harm? Like the person who said that I flipped my hair too much. It didn't hurt me to put it up in a bun, didn't cause any harm, except to the person who then didn't like the bun. But sometimes there are things that, okay, this I don't think this person is trying to help me, but it's making their life difficult. And it's not going to hurt me to make this adjustment in my life. And sometimes we just need to do that. And then sometimes we have to confidently accept what we cannot change. We have to accept the things that, again, for me, I cannot change the fact that I am a woman. I also cannot change the fact that there is something within me that I believe is God put that loves to teach the Word of God. And so I have to work those things and accept what I cannot change. Because there was a time in my life where I did pull back. I pulled myself off the field, benched myself because there had been criticism about that. And so I decided what I did was just put myself on perpetual nursery duty. I stopped teaching, I stopped speaking, and tried to fit into that role that I felt like I was supposed to fit. And I ended up in a severe depression because I couldn't change who I was. And so I don't know if anybody has noticed the ring I wear on my finger. It's Hebrew words. And the word on it is from the scriptures, from the book of Mark. When Jesus, do you remember when the woman came and anointed Jesus' feet there toward the end of his ministry? And then the disciples were very critical of how she ministered to Jesus. Do you remember that? And Jesus' response was, she has done what she could. And so on my ring in Hebrew is that inscription. She has done what she could. And when I'm not sure how to respond to this or do that, sometimes I look down to this ring and say, God, help me that when I stand before you, then you will say you did what you could. And accepting what we cannot change. And then after we've done those things, considered the source, is it something that we could change? And if it's not, accept what we can't, and then you know what you need to do? Get back to work. Do you remember Nehemiah building the wall? And he had those folks that weren't helpful, and they kept coming over, and at one point they come over in chapter 6, and they say, Nehemiah, you need to come down off that wall. We need to talk about all of this. And he finally had just simply said, you know what? I've got too much work to do to come down there and fool with you, and he just got back to doing his work. And sometimes that's what we just have to do, is continue with the work, because we're not going to be able to please all of our critics. Now, if it is constructive, number one, accept that you are not perfect. Do we not struggle with realizing that we have a fault? But listen, there's a lot of clowns in this clown car, and you're one of those clowns. None of us are perfect. And with that, we have to realize we don't have to be, and we have to accept sometimes we need that help and that feedback. And it doesn't mean our entire value is in question. It just means there is something we need to accept, that we have room for improvement. And that's one of the things that I have wished from our politicians. You know, I watched the debate last night, and one of the things I have wished that we could get politicians who will do when they're called on something that they didn't do well, I would just love to hear one of them say, you know, I didn't handle that well. I should have done better, and from here on out, I'm going to do better. Just accept that you blew it, own up to it, and move on. So accept that you are not perfect, and embrace healthy criticism. We typically want to push it away, but we need healthy criticism. When Brother Aiken is giving piano lessons, one of the things I'm sure you did was give some criticism. And if he did not do that, then the mistake that the student was making by not understanding the difference between a flat and a sharp, without his feedback, without his criticism, they would never improve as a pianist, correct? And so we need to embrace that, and it is even okay about being intentional in asking somebody to critique you. When I was pastoring, I had somebody in my life, and she was a bright, brilliant woman, and I asked her name was Diane, and I went to Diane one time, and I called her in, and I said, Diane, you know some things that I don't know. And I am going to give you a carte blanche permission. When you see me doing something that you think I could do better, I want you to feel an obligation to come into this office and tell me. And boy, she did. And boy, did I learn. I needed that. But another thing I have learned in my life is that sometimes I need the critics who aren't even healthy because they keep me on my toes. Because I know that they are going to be watching for any mistake that I make, and so I just need that little bit of push to stay on my toes. You know what I'm saying there? And then when that comes and it's constructive and you realize you've got something to deal with, and make a plan to address the issue. How am I going to deal with that? Well, if it's my piano playing, I'm going to practice an hour every day. I'm going to learn. I'm going to address this issue in my life. If it's a matter of somebody tells you, you know what? You just really, when you speak, you come across as rude. Make a plan to address that issue. How could I do that? Well, you could ask somebody to, every time you say something that sounds rude, ask your wife or your husband to just pat you on the arm. And then you'll start to catch, I'm doing it again. Maybe you don't want to ask your husband to do that, but it might not be bad. And then ask for some measurable ways improvement could be made. Because as we work to improve, we can ask for those things. And then finally, do your best. I am a believer in doing your best. Life is too short to be throwing out mediocre and mediocrity. We want to do our best. Some of the best advice I ever got from a teacher was this. She said, Ruthie, write your paper, but don't put your name on it. Write the entire paper, and then when you're done, look at that paper and say, do I want my name attached to this paper? Do your best. But once you have done your best, don't expect more than what that is. Because some of us have a habit of beating ourselves up. Anybody else a perfectionist? Yeah, bless our hearts. Marshall Field, many of you are familiar with Marshall's department store. But Marshall Field had this hanging in his store, and I think it's pretty good. It's not from the book of Job, but I think it's helpful. Marshall Field hung this up. He said, those who enter to buy support me. Those who come to flatter will please me. Those who complain teach me how I may please others so that more will come. Only those hurt me who are displeased but do not complain, because they refuse me permission to correct my errors and improve my service. What a way to process. So, what can we learn? And then the next thing we see is take your case to God. Job says, oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. Because, see, the prosecuting attorneys had been after him for chapters and chapters. And he says, I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. And so what we need to do is, number one, we need to be wary. There in Job 4, we see one of his criticizers say this, and I'm just throwing this out so that we are aware that this has been happening since the book of Job, where we see one of them say, behold, I had a dream, and a vision came to me, and the vision was everything that's wrong with you, Job. Be wary of God told me kind of people. And you'll have people who will do this. If it rings true to something that God has already told you, and they confirm it, then grab hold of that. But when somebody comes to you and says, God told me, I had somebody at CBC that apparently God told them that we should marry. But God had not told me that. So I was under no obligation. I took that to God. God didn't say yes, so I moved on. Be wary of those people. Ask yourself, am I doing my best for God? And then ask God the same question. And listen to what he says. And I love this. Entrust yourself to his judgment. Listen to this. You have been called for this purpose because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example. An example in what? His suffering. so that you would follow in his steps. So here's the example in suffering that Peter is saying to the church, you should follow. He who committed no sin, he wasn't wrong, he didn't do anything wrong. No deceit was found in his mouth, and yet they treated him badly. They criticized him all through his ministry. But look what it says. While being abusively insulted, he did not insult in return, because he was a respectful person. While suffering, he did not threaten. But here is the secret, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. Could I just tell you, if you have been criticized quite a bit and have carried that, those are not the ones that you will ultimately stand before on the judgment day. That person is not going to be there pointing the finger and telling everybody what a rotten person you are. Instead, you will have a judge who judges righteously, fairly. And Peter says, entrust yourself to that judge. Take your case to God and then strengthen yourself in the Lord. Job said this, as for me, all of your criticism, but as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last, he will take his stand on the earth. And even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. And take your strength from knowing that one day you will stand before a righteous God, and he ultimately is the one with whom you have to do. And he will give the ultimate say on the things that you have done and the person that you have been. And then lastly, pray for and bless your critic. Job 42. Why did God tell Job to do this? Because he said to him, pray for your friends. Why did he tell him to do that? The Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord increased all that Job had twofold. One of the reasons that we need to do this is because not so much for what it does for them, but what it does for us. Because the issue is, after we've been through all of this, now we need healing. Job, at the end of the book, needed healing, didn't he? From all of this stuff that had gone on, God said, pray for your friends. Because Jesus knew this as well. He said this in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you remember that? Bless those who persecute you, and pray for those who despitefully use you. Why? Because until we are able to ask God to bless them, until we are able to say, God, I bring this person to you, and I ask you to bless them. Don't hold back. Give them a raise, God. Give them good kids. Bless them. Give them a new house and heal them of all of their things. Because when we do that, what we are doing is we are doing some preemptive work, because if we don't do this, then when we see them again, all we will see is a critic, and all we will hear is their criticism. But if we have prayed for them, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Jesus gave us this example. Stephen gave us this example. When we do that, then we break the power of the ongoing pain. Because there's the initial pain of the criticism, right? But then there's the ongoing pain. And this is the key to breaking the ongoing pain. So Peter says this, to sum up, all of you, be harmonious, learn how to get along. Be sympathetic, be brotherly, be kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil, or insult for insult, but instead giving a blessing. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. Because here's a principle for you. God blesses those who bless others. And so once all of this is done and we've done all of this processing, then at the end we bless, because then God will be able to bless us. Amen? And sometimes we just need to do that. One of my greatest critics when we were pastoring, used to go to Taco Bell after every service and sit and tear us apart. And we'd had several people in the church, because he'd invite people in the church over and they'd come up and say, do you know what he's doing at Taco Bell after service? And we did, because several people had told us. And it got into my craw, Bob, and I struggled. And I asked God, what should I do? And the Lord reminded me of the Sermon on the Mount. Bless those who persecute you and pray for those who despitefully use you. And I thought, oh, how am I supposed to bless him? And what came to my mind was to go up and buy him $50 worth of Taco Bell gift certificates. So that if he was going to go to Taco Bell and talk about us, we could at least pay for the tacos. And every time I struggled with him, he got more gift certificates to Taco Bell. I'd leave him on his chair, and they'd just show up, and it was my way of keeping that from tearing me apart. So Lord, help us. Help us, Father. Some of us, the criticisms that we hear are 60 years old, but we still hear them, Lord. They wake us up in the middle of the night. Things that were said that were hurtful. Some of them were so unkind, and we've carried them for a long time. Lord, would you please teach us how to bless those who have hurt us, how to release them through the power of forgiveness. Lord, teach us that we still have things to learn, and there may be things that we need to adjust and grow in. And not only is that okay, it's good. So Lord, would you make us people that we can be trusted for you to let people in our lives that may be hurting, and Lord, teach us how to bless others even when we don't feel blessed in return. Because ultimately we want to see you and hear you say, well done. And if everybody else says that was a lousy job, but you say well done, God, that's worth it all. Help us to do what we can. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Next week we will wrap up, and then we will go somewhere else. All right, we love you. May the Lord bless you as you bless others. In Jesus' name.